Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of our webinar series. This month, we're going to be talking about the misuse of parental alienation allegations in family courts. But first, of course, our warning that some of the content you're about to hear could be a little bit upsetting for some people, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause the playback if you need to. We'd also like to acknowledge that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory. We also operate on Treaty 1 territory, and these are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and also comprise the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. So a little bit of a roadmap. We're going to be talking about what parental alienation is to start off. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how it is misused in family courts. We're going to then move on to talking about how parental alienation allegations are a form of gender-based violence. And then at the end, I will share some resources, and of course, all of our contact information will be at the end for you as well. So parental alienation might seem like a bit of an unfamiliar term for a lot of people, but I think that once we start getting into it a little bit, you'll kind of recognize kind of the dynamics that we're talking about, and maybe you haven't given it the term parental alienation before or experienced that term, but I think a lot of the concepts that we're going to be talking about are going to be quite recognizable to people once we kind of start to get going. So the term was originally parental alienation syndrome, and it was coined in 1985 by a psychiatrist by the name of Richard Gardner in the United States. This concept quickly became controversial and then was discredited as a syndrome as a whole, and kind of very soundly rejected by the scientific community and the psychiatric community. Parental alienation syndrome was a concept that Gardner used to try and discredit all allegations of child sexual abuse or domestic and family violence. So this quote here, I think, explains it very well. It says that Gardner claimed that when children reject their father and they or their mother make abuse allegations, this behavior is most likely the product of parental alienation syndrome rather than actual experiences of abuse. Parental alienation syndrome theory is thus premised on the assumption that child abuse claimants' believability and trustworthiness are highly suspect. So parental alienation was, again, very problematic right from the start, as you can see kind of from this quote. Gardner was referring to scenarios where children would gravitate away from one parent, typically the father, in favor of another parent, typically the mother. And basically his argument was that gravitation away from one parent or feeling unsafe with one parent was not the result of any kind of abuse, but was just because it was basically that the mother was doing it. So it basically was a tactic to discredit all abuse allegations, try to nullify them, and to kind of cast suspicion on the mother. As I mentioned, parental alienation syndrome has been overwhelmingly rejected as a theory by the scientific community, also now by social service workers. It's been strongly opposed by the American Psychiatric Association. It's intentionally not been included in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. That is what psychiatrists and psychologists use to diagnose mental illness and mental health challenges. However, unfortunately, the concept of parental alienation has been a little bit slower to be removed from the justice system, and allegations of parental alienation have kind of stuck around in that sense and have become even more of an abuse tactic than they had been previously. So we can see, of course, how problematic parental alienation syndrome as a concept, and then subsequently parental alienation has been. Not only does it deny that a child abuse or domestic violence occurs, it's a victim blaming tactic as well. It tries to divert accountability from the perpetrator onto the victims and survivors, and it pathologizes a very normal behavior of children gravitating away from an abusive parent or an unsafe parent. And that's really not helpful in a lot of cases, to pathologize what is a very normal behavior, and to say that there's something wrong with that behavior when, of course, that's not the case. So how have parental alienation allegations been misused in family courts? Quite a lot. Allegations of parental alienation by one parent are now typically used to diminish allegations or abuse of violence, allegations of abuse or violence on the part of the other parent. It is overwhelmingly, statistics have found usually this is happening in heteronormative relationships, and the father is overwhelmingly the accuser of parental alienation and accusing the mother of parental alienation. So unfortunately, there has been in the family court system and in the court system as a whole a lack of education around dynamics of family and domestic violence, and this contributes to the continued misuse of parental alienation allegations, because then it's not recognized as an abuse tactic, when it very much is. So even though it's been discredited as pseudoscientific within the psychiatric community and by social service workers and by scientists, the justice system has been slow to catch up on this, and this has meant that harm is continuing to be perpetrated and allowed to happen in the family court system. And also because the family court system tends to emphasize shared parenting a lot more than perhaps it had in the past. This can mean that parental alienation allegations cause harm to children in that way as well. So when, for example, a father accuses a mother of parental alienation because she has alleged that child abuse or domestic violence is happening, the parental alienation allegations are taken more seriously rather than the abuse allegations. And because the allegation of parental alienation has been made, the resulting emphasis on shared parenting means that there can be harm to children if they are forced to spend time with an abusive or unsafe parent, because the parental alienation allegations were taken more seriously and addressed in a more substantial manner than the abuse or domestic violence allegations. And that kind of is encapsulated in this quote here, which says that judges are more likely to focus on alienating behaviors than IPV, or intimate partner violence, when determining custody and access. IPV is rarely condemned or related to children's best interests in the way that alienation is. Parental alienation allegations have the effect of discrediting women's allegations of IPV and child abuse. So that kind of sums up what I had just mentioned in a very succinct way. And this is from a research article that was done 4 years ago, it looks like, on parental alienation allegations in family courts. So there have been multiple studies actually that have shown that false allegations of child abuse are not common. And that's part of the reason why parental alienation as a concept has been so soundly dismissed by scientists and psychiatrists, because we know that child abuse allegations that are false are just not very common. And by courts honing in on that parental alienation aspect rather than the abuse allegation, it shifts important focus away from what the real issue is. There have been studies of family court cases where parental alienation allegations and IPV or abuse allegations were both present. And it was found that in several cases, judges didn't think that the presence of IPV affected children, and they didn't think that it was necessary to factor it in to custody decisions in the vast majority of cases, which is really alarming. The kind of thought process there is that if, for example, we know that domestic violence is often perpetrated by the father against the mother. So in cases where IPV is happening, it seems to be the thought process that judges feel that just because dad was abusive or violent towards the mother, but not towards the kids, that if the parents are separated, then father is a safe person to be with. And that is just completely not the case at all. If somebody is violent towards, one person, there is nothing to say that they wouldn't be violent towards anybody else in the future. The presence of violence at all put somebody's parenting abilities in jeopardy just by default. If somebody is perpetrating violence against somebody else, that greatly impacts their ability to soundly parent. And I think that is not recognized in the family court system, clearly, as this statistic is showing. And the same study showed that instead of asking whether the father's IPV, or intimate partner violence, affected the children's best interests, some judges asked whether mothers could facilitate fathers' relationships with the kids in light of IPV. So not only are judges not taking into account that the father's abuse perpetration is negating the kid's best interests, they're then re-exposing the mothers who have been the targets of this violence to the abuser by forcing the kids to have a relationship with an abuser, and forcing the mother to facilitate that. So it's on two accounts, really, that it becomes dangerous for IPV to not be addressed in the family courts, and to shift focus from IPV allegations to parental alienation allegations. It continuously puts the mother and children at risk of abuse. It perpetuates abuse cycles. It prevents accountability for abusive behavior, and it privileges fathers' contact with children over the best interests of the children and the safety of the mother. It is not ever the safest option to force contact with an abusive parent, just because there is an emphasis on shared parenting in the family court system. So we've kind of already touched on this a little bit, but parental alienation is very much a form of gender-based violence. And that is because, as I mentioned before, overwhelmingly it is fathers who are accusing mothers of parental alienation. And in turn, when parental alienation allegations are given more focus in the family court setting than intimate partner violence or abuse allegations, that diverts significant focus away from addressing important issues like IPV and abuse. And this quote here encapsulates that very well. It says, "Mothers who resist shared parenting due to concerns about quality of care or child safety with the other parent are blamed for severing the child from the father. Terms used to blame mothers who resist paternal contact have ranged from bad, vindictive, implacably hostile to no contact mothers, and now alienating mothers. An unfortunate consequence is that women may be advised by lawyers not to talk about IPV in order to avoid allegations of parental alienation or not to request sole custody." So when parental alienation allegations are used in family court, really what it does is punish mothers or safe parents for being concerned about the well-being of their children in the presence of the abusive or unsafe parent, and causes those abuse cycles to perpetuate when children and mothers are forced to have continued contact with an abuser, because of that emphasis on shared parenting and the optics around parental alienation and allegations of parental alienation. One study found that when a father made parental alienation allegations against a mother who was claiming that domestic or intimate partner violence or child abuse was happening, the mother's claim of abuse was more likely to be discarded by the court. And that kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where claims of parental alienation are privileged over domestic violence or intimate partner violence and child abuse claims, and given more attention than those domestic, intimate partner violence or child abuse claims. Several studies have actually shown also that mothers are more likely to be accused of parental alienation, while fathers are more likely to make parental alienation allegations, which again shows that there is a gender disparity, not only in who is being accused of parental alienation, but also who is doing the accusing. It also found that in cases where parental alienation and IPV or abuse claims are both present, again, parental alienation is addressed much more frequently than IPV or abuse claims. And again, just reiterating that IPV is a gendered crime, which makes parental alienation an issue that significantly affects mothers when it is privileged over addressing IPV or abuse claims. Given how severely that domestic violence and intimate partner violence affects children, being in homes where those types of things are happening, witnessing it, being around it, growing up with that around them. It's problematic that courts often don't consider how IPV perpetration affects parenting ability and how indirect violence affects children. So just because the father was abusive towards the mother and not the children does not mean that he's not perpetrating violence against the children. It's just indirect. When children experience violence indirectly in terms of witnessing domestic violence and intimate partner violence, it greatly affects their brain development, and it can cause trauma and negative effects down the line in terms of health and well-being. And not taking into account that does a significant disservice to children going through the family court system. One study said the presence of domestic violence tends to be seen by judges as manifestation of the conflict of separation to which both partners contribute, even when one parent, usually the father, is the primary perpetrator or instigator. So not addressing domestic violence or IPV in family court cases doesn't take into consideration power dynamics in cases of domestic violence or IPV. It doesn't take into account the effects of violence perpetration on parenting ability or on children. Somebody who is perpetrating domestic violence or IPV against a spouse or partner is not a safe parent to be around their children. And not addressing those IPV and domestic violence allegations in family courts continues that cycle of abuse and continues to put children at risk. Another study said that research findings may reflect a broader phenomenon in the family court and child protection systems. So the tendency to blame women for either their actions or their inaction when it comes to protecting their children from men's violence, and to shift the focus away from men's violence onto women's, quote, inadequacies as mothers. So this reflects what we discussed last month in terms of DARVO with the denying, attacking, and reversing victim and offender. It also speaks to differing societal expectations around motherhood and fatherhood. So when women are alleged to be participating in parental alienation for protecting their children from a violent or abusive parent, what we're really doing is blaming victims of abuse and survivors of abuse. And you can see that there's a gender differential again, because women are much more likely to be accused of parental alienation for protecting their children, and abusive fathers are more likely to be the ones accusing mothers of parental alienation. So all of the information that you've heard today comes from a lot of these resources. Some are available online here. You can just follow the links, and they'll also be linked in the description below. And finally, our contact information. So please feel free to contact us at any time. We'd be happy to hear from you and do what we can to assist. Thank you.